Patrick Cockburn, since the late 1980s, you have established yourself as an authority on Russia and the Middle East. Your focus has largely been on Iraq. You published 9 books, but 3 of them have been on Iraq. You've won 9 prestigious awards. You really need no introduction. Like your 2 brothers, you have followed your father, Claud Cockburn, into journalism. All of you have different specialities, although you collaborated on some work. Today, we're here to talk about The Week, which was founded, published, and largely edited, and completely written by your father, the late, great Claud Cockburn. Your interest now, and the reason we're talking to you, is because you seem to have turned more recently from political books into more personal, but not necessarily less political studies, and this brings you in a way very close to the subtopic of this talk, because we're not only talking about the editor of The Week as a political publication, but we're talking about your father, and therefore you bring a particular aspect to this conversation. So please tell us a bit more about The Week.
Well, The Week was, as you say, a very small publication, which had a very great influence. It was really of its time in the 1930s. In fact, my father, Claud, started it after he'd had to flee from Germany just before Hitler came to power. Hitler came to power, I think, was on the end of January 1933. And Claud thought, did he dare stay? But friends said, look, you're on the Nazi blacklist. You're known to be a friend of anti-Nazis. You could easily be beaten to death by the stormtroopers. So he left. He went to Vienna. He'd already had thoughts about starting up a small publication which would fill the vacuum of information about the rise of fascism, the Nazis, Hitler, but the general convulsions that were happening all over Europe and in the world at the same time. Remember, Japan had invaded Manchuria, was to leave the League of Nations later in the year. The whole world was exploding at that moment. And he felt a small publication that filled that vacuum, that had good information, would have an influence completely out of proportion to the size of its circulation.
You're situating Claud Cockburn's political upbringing, political education, very much in Europe in the 20s. Would you like to take us back to Claud's upbringing and early years in East Asia?
Claud was born in Beijing in 1904. His father had spent 30 years in China, spoke fluent Chinese, was a British diplomat. He later went on and became consul general in Korea, where, and this slightly mirrors what Claud did later. He eventually resigned from the Foreign Office, and he did so in protest because he'd been trying to protect a Korean journalist who worked on a paper. There were a couple of papers which were against the Japanese occupation. And the Japanese, although these weren't very big publications, and you would have thought this was pretty small-time resistance, were sort of completely overreacted to this attack by this journalist. They arrested him. My grandfather thought that if he fled to British-controlled territory. My grandfather thought that if he was handed back to the Japanese, they'd torture him. He refused for a long time to hand him over, eventually was pressured to do so by the Foreign Office, and resigned shortly thereafter. It rather mirrors what happened with The Week, my father's publication, that
Mm.
a small voice, if it is saying the right thing in the right circumstances, has enormous influence and can often provoke tremendous reaction by the powers that be. He went back to Britain. He went to Oxford. His father had by this time had a diplomatic posting in Hungary. He went there. He got to know Central Europe very well. He then started working for the Times as a freelancer in Berlin in the late 20s, and then joined the staff of the Times in 1929. And they thought highly of him, and they sent him almost immediately to be correspondent in New York, where he arrived just as the great crash was coming.
Mm.
He'd already, his opinions were radical, but this made them even more radical because he could see sort of
Mm.
capitalism collapsing around him. And then
Mm.
he came back, resigned from the Times, rather to the amazement of his employers, who thought he had a stellar journalistic career in front of
Yes,
him.
yes.
But he felt he must get back to Europe because that's where the action was. And also remember that the Times and the mainline American and British press at this time were quite happily welcoming Hitler into office, saying that he'll calm down. He's not as bad as he looks, you know.
Mm.
I
Mm.
think the Observer said they'd noticed that his religious ideals might influence Hitler. So somebody who said something entirely different was going
Mm.
to have quite an impact.
Nobody ever left the Times. Once you're in, you stayed in. But along with his school friend, the novelist Graham Greene, Claude did abandon a very promising career at the Times. It seems this was largely to free himself from a consensus that was being formed at the Times, and in other significant circles in press and politics. So there he was, writing in stormy times. He'd left the Times, but he did something different. He was not alone in speaking against the consensus, but what he did was he founded a forum for his views and the views of people in his circle. So what do you think was going on there? Why Claude and why The Week?
Yes, his calculation, and he almost developed, he did develop a sophisticated theory of journalism, perhaps one could say guerrilla journalism, that because all the mainline media was not really reporting what was happening, was not really reporting what informed people were talking about, there was not only a vacuum of information to be filled, but there were quite a lot of people who were very conscious that they weren't finding out about matters of enormous importance. I mean, matters which turned out to determine the fate of Europe and the world. And he could, this pool, he could, as it were, plug into this pool and influence them strongly.
I'd like to do a bit of situationing here. In August 1932, Claude has left the Times. He then starts publishing The Week the following spring, March 1933, in the attic of a building in Victoria, London. The impression you get of The Week, looking at it and looking at the history of The Week, is that this was a one-man band, but he has some company in this photograph. He wasn't entirely alone. And of course, he had to borrow money from different people to start the publication at about £40. The mimeograph machine is installed. He's ready to go. Can you tell us a bit more about this confluence of circumstances? What else was going on in the world? What else was happening for Claude? Why start The Week then?
Well, you know, there was a sort of genuinely romantic story how he started it. He had no resources, but he was very self-confident. He realized that, because he knew various people who had run very influential, you know, newsletters, that a mimeograph machine and one person could have a great impact. One person because he, you know, nobody could sack him because he ran it. Nobody could influence him to tone it down, which he had no plans to do. He had a small office and no money, so he thought nobody would bring a legal action against him because they certainly won't get any money out of him. And he also thought that a publication like that must appeal a lot to a limited number of people. He said it was always a mistake in most newspapers that they try to appeal to lots of people and of divergence of views. So they might appeal to a lot of people a little bit, but nobody a great deal. He wants to appeal to people, to a certain core of people, hopefully influential people, a great deal. And rather surprisingly, he succeeded in doing that.
Where do you think Claude found his confidence? Was it simply that he thought he was right? Or could he read the wind?
Yes, I never. It's always rather surprised me, although obviously I knew him very well. And it wasn't merely that. I mean, it sounds sort of almost easy when one explains, when he explained, or when I try and explain why he started the week, why it was a success. And one's almost surprised why aren't people doing this all over the place? Now, one of the reasons he could start it on £40 was he didn't pay himself. He lived off a few, at many points he had no money at all. I remember, he read at one point he was in Paris. This was when sort of a little bit earlier, and he got meat from the butcher for his dog. One time, he got the meat from the butcher and divided it in two between himself and the dog, because there was nothing else. He said the dog looked very distressed by this. But, he always made a joke out of these things. But lots of people really don't like to live like that, not really knowing where the next £5 is coming from, and sometimes not even knowing where the next meal was coming from. So he had great sort of confidence. I think he was very highly principled. He came from a Scottish family. His father had resigned from the Foreign Office as a matter of principle. He was a conservative guy. He wasn't a radical guy, but he did have high principles. His grandfather was a Scottish judge who was known for, as sort of to be a very principled man. And so I think he was high principled. And he was also very experienced, he was born in Beijing, but he left at the age of 4. But then, he'd gone to Central Europe. He spoke fluent German and French. He lived in France for a bit. From quite an early stage, he was very familiar with different places and cultures in Europe in a way that I don't think you would have found in Britain at the time of a young man like that. So he, as the 30s went on, he was always sort of zipping around Europe, plugging into different places. And of course, then fought in the Spanish Civil War a little bit later.
He leaves his job at the Times. Hitler becomes Chancellor, January 33. Japan walks out of the League of Nations, February 1933. And then in March, the following March, up starts the week, just with all of those things happening. And it feels as if it's not just a matter of confidence, but of urgency almost when he started that. And then 3 years after that, of course, he was in Spain. He published his book, Reporter from Spain. And then, then there's the Japanese aerial bombing of Shanghai in the Second War in Shanghai. All of these things are happening, and there are forces for and against. And of course, this brings us to the Cliveden set. Would you like to try to explain the Cliveden set?
Sure, yes. And the Cliveden set, and he invented the phrase, which sort of made them famous, were really a coterie of wealthy, well-connected people, some of them aristocrats, some not, who met at Cliveden House, which was the Astors' palatial house overlooking the Thames in Buckinghamshire. They tend to be sympathetic to Germany, tolerant or sympathetic to Hitler. They looked for an accommodation with Germany, what a little later were called the appeasers of Germany. And in return, they expected Hitler would leave the British Empire alone. They were very committed to the British Empire, and Britain would leave Germany to do what it wanted in Eastern Europe, and probably would not have been too upset if he'd attacked the Soviet Union. They were deeply anti-communist. There were people like Nancy Astor, who was an MP, seems to me one of the more unpleasant women ever to exist on the planet, anti-Semitic, very arrogant, very poor judgment, Lord Lothian, and who had been private secretary to Lloyd George, later became British ambassador in Washington, Geoffrey Dawson, who had been Claude's main editor on the Times, had actually hired Claude, and was sorry to see him go, but was very pro-German. So, collectively, these were very important people. Claude had been writing, attacking them. He had sort of lots of details and so forth. And this all fell flat. Nothing much happened. Then one day he wrote a piece, much the same information as before, entitled Cliveden Set, and it sort of took off as a phrase which was partly to do with what happened at Cliveden, obviously, but became a general sort of name for well-off, right-wing, upper-class sympathizers with Hitler, the appeasers, and that sort of spread through Britain and spread with really astonishing rapidity to the US and the rest of the world.
Claude used the word set for the Cliveden set, but there doesn't seem to have been much conscious plotting for any particular specific aim among the Cliveden group of appeasers. It seems more like the development of a consensus than something cooked up in the back room by wealthy and influential people. Take, for example, Anthony Eden. He was brought into some sort of a meeting, but then he backed out at the last minute. This doesn't really seem very sophisticated.
Yeah, there was that. These people that were originally brought them together is that they'd been brought by the at the end of the war in South Africa at the beginning of the century to sort of by the man in charge, Lord Milner. Many of these people had been brought to South Africa as sort of bright young things. They were deeply interested in consolidating, strengthening the British Empire. That was probably an abiding theme for a lot of them. They were pretty naive too about Hitler, but Claude used to say, it was accused of he'd invented the set, and he would say, well, no, these were people who were sort of acting, coordinating together. I think a lot of people have a rather conspiratorial view of history. They think that a group of people who are acting together with a common purpose sort of sit down around a table with a chairman and decide to, have a conspiracy. I don't think it works like that. I don't think it worked like that at Cliveden or elsewhere, but there were a lot of people who had common, they didn't really need to plot because they all had common ideas and a common purpose. Yes, but I mean, that's in the nature of a house party. I mean, when you have people with a common purpose who may be a very potent group, but if they've existed long enough, you don't really need to organize them. That doesn't mean that they aren't extremely powerful. Claude said that some people may have turned up at Cliveden just because they wanted to have a good dinner. They may just have been cat's paws, of the Cliveden set, but he would, the paws are part of the cat, so. So I think in general terms, what he wrote was correct. And was, I think, also pretty influential. I think it certainly discredited a lot of the people like Nancy Astor who were part of this group, and ultimately played a role in discrediting the appeasers as a whole.
So if you
did for them was when Hitler attacked, but it's but I think that Claude was onto it early and was really pretty effective there.
Patrick, I don't want to overdo the communist thing, but after 1929 and Claude's time in New York, when everything seemed to be falling apart, it did look as if it was very much part of Claude's mission, communism, and it did color the way the week was seen, at least in Britain, until the pact with Stalin made it almost respectable. There were certainly circles in government, in the British government, who saw communism as a far greater threat in Europe, and certainly in East Asia, than Nazism or Japanese ambitions in China. How do you see Claud Cockburn and the week in relation to communism?
I think that you have to go back. I think that people often got Claude wrong. That he was a quite sort of serious revolutionary. And he was a revolutionary, a very radical, somebody who wanted radical change. And that sort of was before he joined the Communist Party. He joined the Communist Party later in 1933. They were always, I think, a little bit wary of him. But because he thought that was the most effective machine for revolutionary change and the most effective opponents of the Nazis and the fascists. And of course, that was true at the time. Later in the Civil War in Spain, you know, the units that really fought hardest were the communist ones. The one country that supported the Spanish Republic with arms and advisors was the Soviet Union. And he'd just been in America. He went to America when people were saying, you know, American capitalism has solved all these problems that Marx and Lenin and all these fellows went on about, permanent prosperity. And he arrives in New York, and, you know, October 1929, we have the Great Crash. We then have the Great Depression. So he used to say that it wasn't that he was, people were surprised he joined the Communist Party. He was sort of surprised that more people didn't react really strongly to these calamities. I mean, the Great Depression, Hitler becoming German Chancellor, the rise of fascism across Europe, Japan starting aggressive wars. So he always felt wholly justified in that. But he was a sort of, the point I want to make is he was a revolutionary before he joined the party, and he was a sort of revolutionary after he joined the party too. He was somebody who was committed to radical change at a very deep level.
Claude operated from a network. He had his sources. He had a very significant group of sources. Two of the main sources seem to have been Robert Bastard, who worked right at the absolute center of government. He was principal private secretary, and then permanent undersecretary at the Foreign Office until 1938, when the week was at its height, and war rumors were at their height. And after that, he was always a close advisor. Another source was Polyakov, who had close embassy connections with the Soviet Union, and he worked for official media in Russia. Can you tell us a bit more about these people and what they tell us about Claude's sources? Where did Claude's sources come from?
I think switching to sources of information, it's always difficult to tell this. There are some that people will mention, Polyakov, who had been diplomatic correspondent at the time, so far as I remember. Others, you know, one source, and this we'll talk about Private Eye later, which Claude was associated with. But, you know, when you have newspapers, news media refusing to cover matters which journalists who work for them think are of great significance, then those journalists will often think of some other place where they could get the information out. They'll want to do that because they'll want people to know about something that they know about. And also, if they get the story going, it may be easier for them to report themselves, because they can say to their own publication or news outlet, oh gosh, you know, there's this tremendous story. It started in the week and now it's in The Guardian and somewhere else. You know, you're not the first over the top. So that's another motive. So certainly that was something, and I mean, he says this, that he drew quite a lot of his information from journalists. I should say the police were following him around quite a lot at that time,
Yeah.
and he kept on darting into pubs. Partly because he drank a lot, but partly this is where he was meeting all these journalists and contacts who are passing things on to him.
So that on that in that cartoon, the James Fitton cartoon, you have Claude and John Strachey walking along. Claude muffled up. They're in a park somewhere. Strachey's there. He was formerly a supporter of Mosley, and now he's sort of come round to that. And then you have the tree, and behind the tree there's a policeman. Sort of taking.
Oh yes, this is. I mean, and more than one. I mean, I used to. But in 2004, MI5 and British Domestic Security released their file on Claude, which turned out to be 26 bulky folders. And they weren't much interested in him before he started the week. There's only one entry when he and Graham Greene, the novelist, went on a trip to Germany, to an occupied part of Germany. But from 1933, they were almost obsessively following him. There are memos between senior officials discussing him. They worked out his biography, what he'd done. They talked to people at the Times. But also, which I found pretty fascinating, was that you have sort of policemen who are following him, giving fantastic details of almost ludicrous details. 9:15 he entered the Red Dragon pub. 9:27 exited pub, walked to bus. It's all pretty silly. They're rather interesting. They sent casual agents around to the Week office in this attic on the 7th floor of a building in Victoria Street. It's where New Scotland Yard is now. But to go and engage him in conversation and try and find out things. They didn't really find out anything of great interest, but and they intercepted his letters at the post office and photostated them. They tapped his telephone, and you see lists of people who rang him up, and sometimes part of the conversation. Again, I find that pretty interesting. On the whole, the MI5 officials had a pretty sane view. They took him very seriously. They were well informed. I think, like any intelligence service, they also had quite a number of sort of crackpots who were writing in, and also Claude would make jokes, and which you at one point, for instance, I found a document where a woman had been sitting beside him at dinner, had asked him, presumably she knew he was a sort of radical, when he thought the revolution might begin. And he said, well, he thought it was in fact, he could tell her it was planned for the following Thursday. And it would begin in the Brigade of Guards, which was conveniently placed between Buckingham Palace and the Houses of Parliament, which she immediately sort of wrote. Somehow she had a contact at MI5, wrote to them, retailing this conversation. But there's other stuff like that. But they took him very seriously, and and also at various points, for instance, later in 1933, there's an account in the Week of a cabinet meeting discussing whether Britain should stand by France in opposing German rearmament, which Hitler had started, and that it was only Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, had stood out against this, and the Foreign Office and the War Office and the Admiralty were in favour of it. So it was giving lots of details of who in what at the top of the British establishment, what they wanted and what they said. So immediately MI5 was really worried about this, because they showed he had a pretty good source at the very top, because he was reporting on a cabinet meeting, and one that had taken place, I think, a day earlier. So that sort of thing really did worry them.
Whether or not Claude invented the expression, the Devil's Decade, he did make it the title of his second volume of memoirs, which were published in 1973. And the expression certainly stuck, still used today. To what extent do you think the Devil's Decade caught the essence of the 1930s.
Yes, and I think you see that coming across very much strongly in the week, that all these groups, the Cliveden set, the part of the Foreign Office, I mean, that their anti-communism tended to trump their anti-Nazism,
Yes.
even if they were anti-Nazi to begin with, which of course a lot of them were not.
So, but isn't this grounds for optimism? You say Claude and the Week provided news, but filled a vacuum of information that was maintained by powerful political and publishing interests, and that this vacuum in turn created a well of anxiety and uncertainty, even among insiders. But surely it also increased an appetite for reliable information. And Claud Cockburn and the Week were there, ready and willing to feed that appetite with stories that often came from the heart of government, and not just the British government.
Yes, the Week is that sort of publication. First of all, it requires a certain type of person to run it. Secondly, you need an audience. You know, he said he was sure there was a pool of people who want this sort of information, and that existed. It doesn't always exist. There are decades where it isn't there, and there are decades when it is. And this was a decade when that pool was very much there. So I don't think it's something that people could pull often. The very fact that you had these three press lords, which you just mentioned, Rothermere, Beaverbrook and Astor, all taking a rather similar line, that actually increased the vacuum of information which he wanted to fill. So that sort of, you might think, well, that's going to dominate the news agenda, but actually that increases his opportunities. Claude always argued you needed a platform to do this, in this case, the Week, where people would go to get sort of skeptical, well-informed news, which they couldn't get elsewhere. I think if you can't just have a story which comes out of nowhere, there has to be a reason that people should believe it. It needs a context. It needs to be sort of said in a certain way that people find convincing. Sometimes you have very interesting information which just appears, but nobody pays attention to it. And I think, an example of this is Private Eye, what Claude worked on. He was guest editor, but was never the full editor. Richard Ingram says that, he was partly following the example of the Week, and he looked to Claude's experience as well. And I remember there was one sort of famous issue which Claude came and edited, in which he published the name, I think was the head of MI6, foreign intelligence, which was known among some journalists. But immediately the permanent secretary at the Cabinet Office, summoned a meeting of all the sort of higher ups to discuss this as to whether they should try to act against Claude and so forth. Eventually they decided not, but they had almost hysterics about this. And also there was a chap, completely different type of story, who had, I think, died in mysterious circumstances at a police station. And the guy had managed to find nobody who would pick up this story until he found Claude, who listened to it and published it. And it was all true, and this created a scandal. So, even this was how many years? Almost a quarter of a century after the Week had first been founded.
Yes.
But the same formula and the same approach still worked, and I think probably still does. It's sort of. I think it's an abiding thing about governments. Is one, they have genuine secrets they want to keep. Partly was they want to leak the information themselves. They pretend that they just want to keep secrets because these are. But often it's just they want to control the leak themselves. And also they just want to, having information is part of power. Having secrets is part of power. So when somebody
Absolutely.
like the Week comes along and sort of punctures that and starts publishing stuff that they felt was only the sort of information that would only circulate among the powers that be, they reacted, almost hysterically. You can see the same thing with WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, to my mind.
Absolutely. However, in 2004, when you did go to Moscow to research the Comintern archives, you learned that the powers that be were unhappy with Claud's performance as a correspondent.
This was quite funny. I went to look at the Comintern archives and had some papers about him. And they were very dubious about him, but they didn't sort of really control him. They could see he was sort of radical. They could see he was well connected and, knew a lot of stuff. But they were sort of a bit mystified by him. He seemed to know an awful lot of capitalists as well as communists. And they were particularly angry because at one point Stalin had given an interview to somebody. I can't remember, Bernard Shaw or somebody. I can't actually remember who it was. It wasn't Bernard Shaw, it was somebody else. And Claude was that time working on the Worker, as well as the Week, which is the communist paper. And he cut a lot of Stalin's speech, which was sort of, he found boring or irrelevant. And ever afterwards, these terrified sort of apparatchiks in Moscow would refer to this as this sort of, they wouldn't even say what it was, I think they once said what it was, but generally, this failing that he'd done this. Obviously, they were terrified of what Stalin or his people might say. Well, you can imagine the situation. I think going back a little, Claude was part, at that time in the 30s, there were various people, generally radicals, some communists, all anti-fascists, who were deeply committed anti-fascists, who were German, some Russian, Mikhail Koltsov, who were very effective propagandists against fascism. And he was very much part of that gang. He liked them a lot. They had a very high casualty rate, often killed by Stalin or the communists or the Nazis or whoever. But to my mind, they were a pretty heroic bunch. And he was rather more like a Central European than he was like a sort of typical Englishman.
The Week was hardly a one-off. After all, Claud Cockburn put it together for 13 years, on and off. You had an exceptional journalist writing in exceptional times for an exceptional readership, by intention. Patrick Cockburn, now that the complete holding of the Week has been published online, how do you suggest modern readers and scholars are to take? How are they to approach Claud Cockburn's legendary newsletter? In just as cynical, perhaps just as corrupt times as those that gave rise to the Week, what do you think modern readers might take away from the Week as a publication?
Well, I think that they should see, what it knew. I think they should realize it's journalism, which is attached to, the events of the day, but I think what I would like people to take away from it is that here you could have a single person without resources, with a newsletter in an attic, that had a completely disproportionate influence on the events of the decade. One could argue about how great that was, but it was certainly there. And I think that makes almost a moral point about how much influence an individual can have over the history of their times. If they know what they're doing, if they're highly professional, if they're highly principled, and that can be done. And it can, in certain circumstances, be done by somebody, who doesn't have money and really you'd think that their voice would be drowned out by others. It's quite easy to describe. It's a difficult act to pull, but I
I
think
think-
people should sort of look carefully at the week, perhaps compare it to a few other publications. We mentioned one in Korea. We talked
Mm,
about Private Eye. We
mm,
spoke about WikiLeaks, which is a bit different.
mm,
Uh, uh, when this has happened and why it's happened. And
mm,
I think that would be a very productive way of looking at it. You know, everybody's attracted by David and Goliath stories. And the
mm,
story of the week is to a degree a David and Goliath story. But
mm.
it's also true that on occasion that it is David and not Goliath who comes out on top.